Welcome to the BMG presentation on the global monetary system. Our learning objectives will be to describe the historical development of the modern global monetary system, to explain the role played by the World Bank and the IMF in the international monetary system, to compare and contrast the differences between a fixed and floating exchange rate system, to identify exchange rate regimes used in the world today and why countries adopt different exchange rate regions, to understand the debate surrounding the role of the IMF in the management of financial crises, and finally, to explain the implications of the global monetary system for currency management and business strategy. Our introduction to the IMF and Bretton Woods. The international monetary system refers to the institutional arrangements that countries adopt to govern exchange rates. When the foreign exchange market determines the relative value of a currency, we say that the country is adhering to a floating exchange rate regime. The world's four major trading currencies, the US dollar, the European Union's euro, the Japanese yen, and the British pound, are all free to float against each other. Thus, their exchange rates are determined by market forces and fluctuate against each other on a day-to-day, if not minute-to-minute basis. However, the exchange rates of many currencies are not determined by the free play of market forces. Other institutional arrangements are adopted. Many of the world's developing nations peg their currencies primarily to the dollar or the euro. A pegged exchange rate means the value of the currency is fixed relative to a reference currency, such as the US dollar, and then the exchange rate between that currency and other currencies is determined by the reference currency exchange rate. Other countries, while not adopting a formal pegged rate, try to hold the value of their currency within some range against an important reference currency such as the US dollar. This is often referred to as a dirty float system. It is a float because, in theory, the value of the currency is determined by market forces, but it is a dirty float as opposed to a clean float because the central bank of a country will intervene in the foreign exchange market to try to maintain the value of its currency if it depreciates too rapidly against an important reference currency. A central bank is the generic name given to a country's primary monetary authority, such as the Federal Reserve System in the United States or the Bank of Canada in Canada. It usually has the responsibility for issuing currency, administering monetary policy, holding member banks' deposits, and facilitating the nation's banking industry. Other countries have operated within a fixed exchange rate system in which the values of a set of currencies are fixed against each other at some mutually agreed upon exchange rate. Before the introduction of the euro in 2000, several member states of the European Union operated with fixed exchange rates within the context of the European monetary system. For a quarter of a century after World War II, the world's major industrial nations participated in a fixed exchange rate system. Although this system collapsed in 1973, some still argue that the world should attempt to reimpose it. Pegged, dirty float, and fixed exchange rate systems all require some degree of government intervention in the foreign exchange market to maintain the value of a currency. A currency may come under pressure when the nation experiences significant economic or political problems. Since governments may not have sufficient foreign exchange reserves to defend the value of their currency, they sometimes call on a powerful multinational institution, the International Monetary Fund, or IMF, for loans to help them do this. The IMF is another important player in the international monetary system. We will explain how the international monetary system works and point out its implications for international business. To understand how the international monetary system works, we must review the system's evolution. We will begin with a discussion of the gold standard and its breakup during the 1930s. The Bretton Woods Conference established the basic framework for the post-World War II international monetary system. The Bretton Woods system called for fixed exchange rates against the US dollar. Under this fixed exchange rate system, the value of most currencies in terms of US dollars was fixed for long periods and allowed to change only under a specific set of circumstances. Today, both these institutions continue to play major roles in the world economy and in the international monetary system. We shall discuss the issue in some depth. The Bretton Woods system of fixed exchange rates collapsed in 1973. Since then, the world has operated with a mixed system in which some currencies are allowed to float freely, but many are either managed by government intervention or pegged to another currency. We will explain the reasons for the failure of the Bretton Woods system, as well as the nature of the present system. We will also discuss how pegged exchange rate systems work. Almost 4 decades after the breakdown of the Bretton Woods system, the debate continues over what kind of exchange rate regime is best for the world. Some economists advocate a system in which major currencies are allowed to float against each other. Others argue for a return to a fixed exchange rate regime similar to the one established at Bretton Woods. This debate is intense and important, and we will examine the arguments of both sides. The Bretton Woods Conference also created 2 major international institutions that play a role in the international monetary system: the International Monetary Fund, or IMF, and the World Bank. The IMF was given the task of maintaining order in the international monetary system. The World Bank's role was to promote development. The IMF was also actively involved in helping Greece, Ireland, and Portugal manage their financial crises in 2010. As of January 2014, the IMF had loans outstanding with 84 countries, the majority in the developing world, totaling
$90,073,641,743.
At times of financial crisis, such as what unfolded in 2008 through 11, these loan amounts can spike much higher. There has been a vigorous debate about the role of the IMF and, to a lesser extent, the World Bank, and the appropriateness of their policies for many developing nations. Several prominent critics claim that in some cases, IMF policies make things worse, not better. The debate over the role of the IMF took on new urgency given the institution's extensive involvement in the economies of developing countries during the late 1990s and early 2000s. The Bretton Woods system of fixed exchange rates collapsed in 1973. Since then, the world has operated with a mixed system in which some currencies are allowed to float freely, but many are either managed by government intervention or pegged to another currency. We will explain the reasons for the failure of the Bretton Woods system, as well as the nature of the present system. We will also discuss how pegged exchange rate systems work. Almost 4 decades after the breakdown of the Bretton Woods system, the debate continues over what kind of exchange rate regime is the best for the world. Some economists advocate a system in which major currencies are allowed to float against each other. Others argue for a return to a fixed exchange rate regime similar to the one established at Bretton Woods. This debate is intense and important, and we will examine the arguments of both sides. The gold standard had its origin in the use of gold coins as a medium of exchange, unit of account, and store of value, a practice that dates to ancient times. When international trade was limited in volume, payment for goods purchased from another country was typically made in gold or silver. However, as the volume of international trade expanded in the wake of the Industrial Revolution, a more convenient means was needed. The solution adopted was to arrange for payment in paper currency and for governments to agree to convert the paper currency into gold on demand at a fixed rate. Pegging currencies to gold and guaranteeing convertibility is known as the gold standard. By 1880, most of the world's major trading nations, including Great Britain, Germany, Japan, and the United States, had adopted the gold standard. When global trade was limited in volume, gold and silver were used as payments for goods purchased from another. The Currency Act was first proclaimed on August 1, 1854, and until World War I, Canada remained on the gold standard, whereby the value of the Canadian dollar was fixed in terms of gold. It was also valued at par with the US dollar, with a British sovereign valued at $4.8666 Canadian, and both US and British gold coins were legal tender in Canada. Paper money was freely convertible into gold without restriction, and there were no controls on the export or import of gold. The great strength claimed for the gold standard was that it contained a powerful mechanism for achieving balance of trade equilibrium by all countries. A country is said to be in balance of trade equilibrium when the income its residents earn from exports is equal to the money its residents pay to people in other countries for imports. The current account of its balance of payments is in balance. Suppose there are only 2 countries in the world, Japan and the United States. Imagine Japan's trade balance is in surplus because it exports more to the United States than it imports from the United States. Japanese exporters are paid in US dollars, which they exchange for Japanese yen at a Japanese bank. The Japanese bank submits the dollars to the US government and demands payment of gold in return. This is a simplification of what would occur, but it will make our point. This adjustment mechanism seems so simple and attractive that even today, more than 60 years after the final collapse of the gold standard, some people believe the world should return to a gold standard. Under the gold standard, when Japan has a trade surplus, There will be a net flow of gold from the United States to Japan. These gold flows automatically reduce the U.S. money supply and swell Japan's money supply. There is a close connection between money supply growth and price inflation. An increase in money supply will raise prices in Japan, while a decrease in the U.S. money supply will push U.S. prices downward. The rise in the price of Japanese goods will decrease demand for these goods, while the fall in the price of U.S. goods will increase demand for these goods. Thus, Japan will start to buy more from the United States, and the United States will buy less from Japan until a balance of trade equilibrium is achieved. The gold standard is the practice of pegging currencies to gold and guaranteeing convertibility. The exchange rate between currencies is based on how much gold a unit of each currency would buy. The demand and supply of currencies is influenced by their respective countries' relative inflation rates and interest rates. When the foreign exchange market determines the relative value of a currency, we say that the country is adhering to a floating exchange rate regime. The exchange rate for converting one currency into another is continuously adjusted depending on the laws of supply and demand. This adjustment mechanism seems so simple and attractive that even today, more than 60 years after the final collapse of the gold standard, some people believe the world should return to a gold standard. Gold served and still serves as a hedge against inflation. The gold standard worked reasonably well from the 1870s until the start of World War I. During the war, several governments financed part of their massive military expenditures by printing money. Devaluation of currencies in this period led to a gold standard. Great Britain, which abandoned the gold standard at the beginning of World War I, returned to the gold standard by pegging the pound to gold at the pre-war gold parity level of 4.25 British pounds per ounce, despite substantial inflation between 1914 and 1925. Gold reserves did not match the demand for physical gold. This priced British goods out of foreign markets, which pushed the country into a deep depression. When foreign holders of pounds lost confidence in Great Britain's commitment to maintaining its currency's value, they began converting their holdings of pounds into gold. The British government saw that it could not satisfy the demand for gold without seriously depleting its gold reserves, so it suspended convertibility in 1931. The United States followed suit and left the gold standard in 1933, but returned to it in 1934, raising the dollar price of gold from $20.67 per ounce to $35 per ounce. Since more dollars were needed to buy an ounce of gold than before, the implication was that the dollar was worth less. This effectively amounted to a devaluation of the dollar relative to other currencies. A number of other currencies adopted a similar tactic, and in the cycle of competitive devaluations that soon emerged, no country could win. Pressure on countries' gold reserves forced them to suspend gold convertibility. The start of World War I marked the end of the gold standard era. Most countries suspended the convertibility of domestic banknotes into gold and the free movement of gold between countries. As fear mounted in the days immediately before the declaration of war on August 4, 1914, there were heavy withdrawals of gold from Canadian banks. In an atmosphere of an incipient financial panic, there were concerns about the possibility of bank runs from bank customers rushing to redeem their paper money in gold. Since there was not enough gold to cover for paper money, an emergency meeting was held in Ottawa on August 3, 1914, between the federal government and the Canadian Bankers Association to discuss the crisis. Later that day, an order in council was issued to provide protection for banks, which were threatened by insolvency, by giving banknotes issued by banks legal tender status. This allowed the banks to meet their depositor demands with their own banknotes rather than with Dominion notes or gold. The government also increased the amount of notes that banks were legally permitted to issue. The government was also empowered to make advances to banks by issuing Dominion notes against securities deposited with the Minister of Finance. This provision enabled banks to increase the amount of their banknotes in circulation. A second order in council issued on August 10th suspended the redemption of Dominion notes into gold. With Canada's return to the gold standard from 1926 to 1931, currency supplied by the chartered banks lost its legal tender status, although the government, in the event of an emergency, could restore this status under the Finance Act. Consequently, legal tender in Canada once again consisted of British gold sovereigns and other British gold coins, U.S. gold eagles, double eagles, and half eagles, and Canadian gold coins, denominations of $5 and $10, and Dominion notes. To a lesser degree, legal tender status was also accorded silver, nickel, and bronze coins minted in Canada. On April 10, 1933, an order in council officially suspended the redemption of Dominion notes for gold, thus ending Canada's relationship with the gold standard. The net result in Canada was the shattering of any remaining confidence in the system. With countries devaluing their currencies at will, one could no longer be certain how much gold a currency could buy. By the start of World War II in 1939, the gold standard was dead. The gold standard collapsed in 1944. In 1944, at the height of World War II, representatives from 44 countries met at Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, to design a new international monetary system. With the collapse of the gold standard and the Great Depression of the 1930s fresh in their minds, these statesmen were determined to build an enduring economic order that would facilitate post-war economic growth. There was general consensus that fixed exchange rates were desirable. The Bretton Woods system has intended to build an enduring economic order that would facilitate post-war economic growth. The agreement reached at Bretton Woods established two multinational institutions, the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. The task of the IMF would be to maintain order in the international monetary system, and that of the World Bank would be to promote general economic development. The Bretton Woods Agreement also called for a system of fixed exchange rates that would be policed by the IMF. The IMF would maintain order in the international monetary system, and the World Bank would promote general economic development. Under the agreement, all countries were to fix the value of their currency in terms of gold, but were not required to exchange their currencies for gold. Only the dollar remains convertible into gold, at a price of $35 per ounce. Each country decided what it wanted its exchange rate to be vis-a-vis the dollar, and then calculated the gold par value of the currency based on the selected dollar exchange rate. Other currencies would set their exchange rates relative to the dollar. Although monetary discipline was a central objective of the Bretton Woods Agreement, it was recognized that a rigid policy of fixed exchange rates would be too inflexible. It would probably break down just as the gold standard had. In some cases, a country's attempts to reduce its money supply growth and correct a persistent balance of payments deficit could force the country into recession and create high unemployment. The architects of the Bretton Woods Agreement wanted to avoid high unemployment, so they built limited flexibility into the system. Two major features of the IMF Articles of Agreement fostered this flexibility: IMF lending facilities and adjustable parities. Another aspect of the Bretton Woods Agreement was a commitment not to use devaluation as a weapon of competitive trade policy. A persistent balance of payments deficit can lead to a depletion of a country's foreign reserves, forcing it to devalue its currency. By providing deficit-laden countries with short-term foreign currency loans, IMF funds would buy time for countries to bring down their inflation rates and reduce their balance of payment deficits. The belief was that such loans would reduce pressures for devaluation and allow for a more orderly and less painful adjustment. However, if a currency became too weak to defend, a devaluation of up to 10% would be allowed without any formal approval by the IMF. Larger devaluations required IMF approval. By providing deficit-laden countries with short-term foreign currency loans, the IMF funds would buy time for countries to bring down their inflation rates and reduce their balance of payments deficits. The belief was that such loans would reduce pressures for devaluation and allow for a more orderly and less painful adjustment. The IMF's role was to maintain order in the international monetary system. The IMF Articles of Agreement were heavily influenced by the worldwide financial collapse, competitive devaluations, trade wars, high unemployment, hyperinflation in Germany and elsewhere, and general economic disintegration that occurred between the two world wars. The aim of the Bretton Woods Agreement, of which the IMF was the main custodian, was to try to avoid a repetition of that chaos through a combination of discipline and flexibility. There was a growing debate about the role of the IMF, and to a lesser extent the World Bank, and the appropriateness of their policies for many developing nations. The IMF stood ready to lend foreign currencies to members to tide them over during short periods of balance of payments deficits, when a rapid tightening of monetary or fiscal policy would hurt domestic employment. A pool of gold and currencies contributed by IMF members provided the resources for these lending operations. Criticism number one of the IMF's one-size-fits-all approach to macroeconomic policy was inappropriate for many countries. Tight macroeconomic policies imposed by the IMF are not well suited to poor countries that are suffering from private sector debt crisis with deflationary undertones. A fixed rate regime imposes disciplines in two ways. First, the need to maintain a fixed exchange rate puts a brake on competitive devaluations and brings stability to the world trade environment. Second, a fixed exchange rate regime imposes monetary discipline on countries, thereby curtailing price inflation. For example, consider what would happen under a fixed exchange rate if Great Britain rapidly increased its money supply by printing pounds. The increase in money supply would lead to price inflation. Given fixed exchange rates, inflation would make British goods uncompetitive in world markets, while the prices of imports would become more attractive in Great Britain. The result would be a widening trade deficit in Great Britain, with the country importing more than it exports. To correct this trade imbalance under a fixed exchange rate regime, Great Britain would be required to restrict the rate of growth in its money supply to bring price inflation back under control. Thus, fixed exchange rates are seen as a mechanism for controlling inflation and imposing economic discipline on countries. Criticism number 2 of the IMF's rescue efforts are exacerbating the problem of moral hazard. Moral hazard arises when people behave recklessly because they know they'll be saved if things go wrong. Criticism number 3 of the IMF is that it has become too powerful for an institution that lacks any real mechanism for accountability. The architects of the Bretton Woods Agreement wanted to avoid high unemployment, so they built limited flexibility into the system. The Bretton Woods system tried to avoid a repetition of the chaos that occurred between the wars through a combination of discipline and flexibility. Two major features of the IMF Articles of Agreement fostered this flexibility: IMF lending facilities and adjustable parities. The World Bank promotes general economic development and consists of a group of 5 institutions. The official name for the World Bank is the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, or IBRD. When the Bretton Woods participants established the World Bank, the need to reconstruct the war-torn economies of Europe was foremost in their minds. The bank's initial mission was to help finance the building of Europe's economy by providing low-interest loans. As it turned out, the World Bank was overshadowed in this role by the Marshall Plan, under which the United States lent money directly to European nations to help them rebuild. So the bank turned its attention to development and began lending money to third world nations. In the 1950s, the bank concentrated on public sector projects. Power stations, road building, and other transportation investments were much in favor. During the 1960s, the bank also began to lend heavily in support of agriculture, education, population control, and urban development. The bank lends money under 2 schemes. Under the IBRD scheme, money is raised through bond sales in the international capital market. Borrowers pay what the bank calls a market rate of interest, the bank's cost of funds plus a margin for expenses. This market rate is lower than commercial banks' market rate. Under the IBRD scheme, the bank offers low-interest loans to risky customers whose credit rating is often poor. A second scheme is overseen by the International Development Agency, the IDA, an arm of the bank created in 1960. Resources to fund IDA loans are raised through subscriptions from wealthy members such as the United States, Japan, and Germany. IDA loans go out only to the poorest countries. Borrowers have 50 years to repay at an interest rate of 1% per year. The institutions that work most closely with the World Bank are the IBRD, or the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, the IDA, International Development Association, the IFC, the International Finance Corporation, MIGA, the Multilateral Investment Guarantee Agency, and finally the ICSID, International Center for Settlement of Investment Disputes. Some examples of the IBRD initiatives are the 2009 China Wenchuan Earthquake Recovery Project, the 2006 Tsunami Disaster Recovery in India, the 2006 Haiti Emergency Recovery and Disaster Management Project, the Post-Tropical Storm Jeanne 2004, in 2005 Philippines, the Natural Disaster Risk Management, the 2004 Africa Emergency Locust Project, emergency assistance to 7 countries to deal with the infestation of desert locusts. The fixed exchange rate system established in Bretton Woods collapsed mainly due to the economic management of the USA. The system of fixed exchange rates established at Bretton Woods worked well until the late 1960s, when it began to show signs of strain. The system finally collapsed in 1973, and since then we've had a managed float system. To understand why the system collapsed, one must appreciate the special role of the US dollar in the system. As the only currency that could be converted into gold, and as the currency that served as the reference point for all others, The dollar occupied a central place in the system. Any pressure on the dollar to devalue could wreak havoc with the system, and that is what occurred. Most economists trace the breakup of the fixed exchange rate system to the U.S. macroeconomic policy package of 1965 through 1968. To finance both the Vietnam conflict and his welfare programs, U.S. President Lyndon Johnson backed an increase in U.S. government spending that was not financed by an increase in taxes. Instead, it was financed by an increase in the money supply, which led to a rise in price inflation from less than 4% in 1966 to close to 9% by 1968. At the same time, the rise in government spending stimulated the economy. With more money in their pockets, people spent more, particularly on imports, and the U.S. trade balance began to deteriorate. The increase in inflation and the worsening of the U.S. foreign trade position gave rise to speculation in the foreign exchange market that the dollar would be devalued. Things came to a head in the spring of 1971 when U.S. trade figures showed that for the first time since 1945, the United States was importing more than it was exporting. This set off massive purchases of German Deutschmarks in the foreign exchange markets by speculators who guessed that the mark would be revalued against the dollar. On a single day, on May 4th in 1971, the Bundesbank, Germany's central bank, had to buy $1 billion in Deutschmarks to hold the dollar-Deutschmark exchange rate at its fixed exchange rate, given the great demand for Deutschmarks. On the morning of May 5th, the Bundesbank purchased another $1 billion during the first hour of foreign exchange trading. At that point, the Bundesbank faced the inevitable and allowed its currency to float. In the weeks following the decision to float the Deutschmark, the foreign exchange market became increasingly convinced that the dollar would have to be devalued. However, devaluation of the dollar was no easy matter. Under the Bretton Woods provisions, any other country could change its exchange rate against all currencies simply by fixing its dollar rate at a new level. But as the key currency in the system, the dollar could be devalued only if all countries agreed to simultaneously revalue against the dollar. And many countries did not want this because it would make their products more expensive relative to U.S. products. After a massive wave of speculation in February of 1972, which culminated with European central banks spending $3.6 billion on March 1st to try to prevent their currencies from appreciating against the dollar, the foreign exchange market was closed. When the foreign exchange market reopened on March 19th, the currencies of Japan and most European countries were floating against the dollar. Although many developing countries continue to peg their currency to the dollar, and many do to this day. At that time, the switch to a floating system was viewed as a temporary response to an unmanageable speculation in the foreign exchange market. But it is now nearing 40 years since the Bretton Woods system of fixed exchange rates collapsed. One of the key problems of Bretton Woods was exacerbated when President Nixon announced in August of 1971 that the dollar was no longer convertible into gold. He also announced that a new 10% tax on imports would remain in effect until U.S. trading partners agreed to revalue their currencies against the dollar. This brought the trading partners to the bargaining table, and in December of 1971, an agreement was reached to devalue the dollar by about 8% against foreign currencies. The import tax was then removed. The problem was not solved, however. The U.S. balance of payments position continued to deteriorate through 1972. While the nation's money supply continued to expand at an inflationary rate. Speculation continued to grow that the dollar was still overvalued and that a second devaluation would be necessary. In anticipation, foreign exchange dealers began converting dollars to Deutschmarks and other currencies. The Bretton Woods system had an Achilles heel. The system could not work if its key currency, the U.S. dollar, was under speculative attack. The Bretton Woods system could work only as long as the U.S. inflation rate remained low and the United States did not run a balance of payments deficit. Once these things occurred, the system soon became strained to the breaking point. The Jamaica Agreement's purpose was to revise the IMF's Articles of Agreement to reflect the new reality of floating exchange rates. The main elements of the Jamaica Agreement include the following. Number one, floating rates were declared acceptable. IMF members were permitted to enter the foreign exchange market to even out unwarranted speculative fluctuations. Number two, gold under the terms and conditions of the Jamaica Agreement was officially demonetized in 1976, freeing all currencies to float against gold. Gold remains, even to this day, an important strategic asset held by central banks. It is listed on their balance sheets next to their other official foreign reserves. The IMF itself lists its 2,814 tons of gold on a dedicated line item on its balance sheet. Interestingly, not all IMF member banks are free to randomly reduce their gold reserves. The Washington Agreement, renewed in 2009, limits these 11 European central banks to a maximum sale of their official gold reserves to only 400 tons per year. In contrast to that, there are currently no rules limiting purchases of gold. Many central banks, like China and Russia, for example, have been dramatically increasing their official gold reserves and continue to do so. Number 3, total annual IMF quotas. The amount member countries contribute to the IMF were increased to $41 billion US. Since then, they've been increased to $300 billion, while the membership of the IMF has been expanded to include 188 countries. Non-oil exporting, less developed countries were given greater access to IMF funds. The floating exchange rate regime that followed the collapse of the fixed exchange rate system was formalized in January of 1976, when IMF members met in Jamaica and agreed to the rules for the international monetary system, and those rules remain in place even today. The Jamaica meeting revised the IMF's Articles of Agreement to reflect the new reality of floating exchange rates. Since March of 1973, exchange rates have become much more volatile and less predictable than they were between 1945 and 1973. This volatility has been partly due to a number of unexpected shocks to the world monetary system, including the oil crisis in 1971, when the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, OPEC, quadrupled the price of oil. The harmful effect of this on the U.S. inflation rate and trade position resulted in a further decline in the value of the U.S. dollar. More examples of volatility would be the oil crisis in 1973, the loss of confidence in the dollar that followed the rise of U.S. inflation in 1977 and 1978, the oil crisis of 1979, the unexpected rise in the dollar between 1980 and 1985, the rapid fall of the U.S. dollar against the Japanese yen and German Deutschmark between 1985 and 87, and against the yen between 93 and 95. The partial collapse of the European monetary system in 1992, the 1997 Asian currency crisis, when the Asian currencies of several countries, including South Korea, Indonesia, Malaysia, and Thailand, lost between 50% and 80% of their value against the U.S. dollar in just a few months. The global financial crisis of 2008 through 10, and the sovereign debt crisis in the European Union during 2010 through 11 created even further imbalances. The U.S. dollar had depreciated considerably between 2001 and 2008. The changing value of the U.S. dollar shows the factors that affect currencies generally. Except for a brief speculative flurry around the Persian Gulf War in 91, the dollar was relatively stable for the first half of the 1990s against most major currencies. However, in the late 1990s, the dollar began to appreciate against most major currencies, including the euro after its introduction, even though the United States was running a record balance of payments deficit. The driving force for the appreciation in the value of the dollar was that foreigners continued to invest in U.S. financial assets, primarily stocks and bonds, and the inflow of money drove up the value of the dollar on foreign exchange markets. This inward investment was due to the belief that the U.S. financial assets would offer a favorable rate of return. By 2001, however, foreigners had started to lose their appetite for U.S. stocks and bonds, and the inflow of money into the United States slowed, exacerbated by 9/11. The slowdown in U.S. economic activity during the 2001-2002 period, combined with the slow recovery thereafter, made U.S. assets less attractive. Instead of reinvesting dollars earned from exports to the United States in U.S. financial assets, investors exchanged those dollars for other currencies. One reason for this was the continued growth in the U.S. trade deficit, which hit a record at that time of $856.6 billion in 2006. Although the U.S. trade deficit had been high for decades, this deficit was the largest it had ever been when measured as a percentage of the country's GDP. In addition to the growing trade deficit was the U.S. government's budget deficit, which expanded rapidly after 2001. This led to fears that ultimately the deficit would be financed by an expansionary monetary policy that could lead to growing inflation. Because inflation would reduce the value of the dollar, foreigners decided to hedge against this risk by holding fewer U.S. dollars in their investment portfolios. From 2003 onwards, U.S. government officials began to talk down the value of the dollar, in part because the administration believed that a cheaper dollar would increase U.S. exports and reduce imports, thus improving the U.S. balance of trade position. Foreigners saw this as a signal that the U.S. government would not intervene in foreign exchange markets to prop up the value of the dollar, As a result of all these factors, demand for dollars weakened and the value of the dollar slid on the foreign markets. Interestingly, from mid-2008, the dollar staged a rally against major currencies, despite the fact that the American economy was suffering from a serious financial crisis. The reason seems to be that despite America's problems, things were even worse in many other countries, and foreign investors saw the dollar as a safe haven and put their money in low-risk U.S. assets, particularly low-yielding U.S. government bonds. Thus, we see that in recent history, the value of the dollar has been determined by both market forces and government intervention. Under a floating exchange rate regime, market forces have produced a volatile dollar exchange rate. Governments have responded by intervening in the market, buying and selling dollars, in an attempt to limit the market's volatility and to correct what they see as an overvaluation or potential undervaluation of the dollar. In addition to direct intervention, the value of the dollar has frequently been influenced by statements from government officials. The dollar may not have declined as much as it has since 2001, for example, had not U.S. government officials repeatedly and publicly ruled out any action to stop the decline. The frequency of government intervention in the foreign exchange markets explains why the current system is often referred to as a managed float system or a dirty float system. The breakdown of the Bretton Woods system has not stopped the debate about the relative merits of fixed versus floating exchange rate regimes. Disappointment with the system of floating rates in recent years has led to renewed debate about the merits of fixed exchange rates. The case for fixed exchange rates rests on arguments about monetary discipline, speculation, uncertainty, and the lack of connection between the trade balance and exchange rates. In terms of monetary discipline, the need to maintain fixed exchange rate parity ensures that governments do not expand their money supplies at inflationary rates. It's argued that under a fixed system, a country's ability to expand or contract its money supply as it sees fit is limited by the need to maintain exchange rate parity. We've already discussed the nature of monetary discipline inherent in a fixed exchange rate system when we discussed the Bretton Woods system. The need to maintain a fixed exchange rate parity ensures that governments do not expand their money supplies at inflationary rates. While advocates of floating rates argue that each country should be allowed to choose its own inflation rate, the monetary autonomy argument, advocates of fixed rates argue that governments all too often give in to political pressures and expand the monetary supply far too rapidly, causing unacceptably high price inflation. A fixed exchange rate regime would ensure that this does not occur. Speculation. A fixed exchange rate regime precludes the possibility of speculation. Monetary expansion can lead to inflation, which puts downward pressure on a fixed exchange rate. Critics of a floating exchange rate regime also argue that speculation can cause fluctuations in exchange rates. They point to the dollar's rapid rise and fall during the 1980s, which they claim had nothing to do with comparative inflation rates and the U.S. trade deficit, but everything to do with speculation. They argue that when foreign exchange dealers see a currency depreciating, they tend to sell the currency in the expectation of future depreciation, regardless of the currency's longer-term prospects. As more traders jump on the bandwagon, the expectations of depreciation are realized. Such destabilizing speculation tends to accentuate the fluctuations around the exchange rate's long-run value. It can damage a country's economy by distorting export and import prices. Thus, advocates of a fixed exchange rate regime argue that such a system will limit the destabilizing effects of speculation. Under a fixed rate system, a country's ability to expand or contract its money supply as it sees fit is limited by the need to maintain exchange rate parity. Similarly, monetary contraction requires high interest rates to reduce the demand for money. Higher interest rates lead to an inflow of money from abroad, which puts upward pressure on a fixed exchange rate. Thus, to maintain exchange rate parity under a fixed system, countries were limited in their ability to use monetary policy to expand or contract their economies. Advocates of a floating exchange rate regime argue that removing the obligation to maintain exchange rate parity would restore monetary control to a government. If a government faced with unemployment wanted to increase its money supply to stimulate domestic demand and reduce unemployment, it could do so unencumbered by the need to maintain its exchange rate. Under the Bretton Woods system, if a country developed a permanent deficit in its balance of trade, importing more than it exported, that could not be corrected by domestic policy, the IMF would have to agree to a currency devaluation. In terms of the latter, under the Bretton Woods system, if a country developed a permanent deficit in its balance of trade that could not be corrected by domestic policy, the IMF would agree to a currency devaluation. Speculation also adds to the uncertainty surrounding future currency movements that characterizes floating exchange rate regimes. The unpredictability of exchange rate movements in the post-Bretton Woods era has made business planning difficult, and it makes exporting, importing, and foreign investment risky activities. Given the volatile exchange rate, international businesses do not know how to react to the changes, and often they do not react. Why change plans for exporting, importing, or foreign investment after a 6% fall in the dollar this month, when the dollar may rise 6% next month? This uncertainty, according to the critics, dampens the growth of international trade and investment. They argue that a fixed exchange rate, by eliminating such uncertainty, promotes the growth of international trade and investment. Disappointment with the system of floating rates in recent years has led to renewed debate about the merits of a fixed exchange rate system. The case for floating exchange rates has two main elements: monetary policy autonomy and automatic trade balance adjustments. Critics of this system argue that the adjustment mechanism works much more smoothly under a floating exchange rate regime. They argue that if a country is running a trade deficit, the imbalance between the supply and demand of that country's currency in the foreign exchange markets will lead to depreciation in its exchange rate. Under the floating rate regime, there is a lack of connection between the trade balance and exchange rates. While monetary expansion might lead to inflation, this would lead to a depreciation in the country's currency. A floating exchange rate has two main elements: monetary policy autonomy and automatic trade balance adjustments. Although domestic inflation would have an impact on the exchange rate under a floating exchange rate regime, it should have no impact on businesses' international cost competitiveness due to the exchange rate depreciation. The rise in domestic costs should be exactly offset by the fall in the value of the country's currency on the foreign exchange markets. Similarly, a government could use monetary policy to contract the economy without worrying about the need to maintain parity. Which side is right in the vigorous debate between those who favor a fixed exchange rate and those who favor a floating exchange rate remains unclear. Economists cannot agree on this issue. From a business perspective, this is unfortunate because business, as a major player in the international trade and investment scene, has a large stake in the resolution of the debate. Would international business be better off under a fixed regime or a flexible rates better? The evidence is not clear. We do, however, know that a fixed exchange rate regime modeled along the lines of the Bretton Woods system will not work. Speculation ultimately broke the system, a phenomenon that advocates of fixed rate regimes claim is associated with floating exchange rates. Nevertheless, a different kind of fixed exchange rate system might be more enduring and might foster the stability that would facilitate more rapid growth in international trade and investment. In the next section, we look at potential models for a system and the problems with such systems. Governments around the world pursue a number of different exchange rate policies. These range from a pure free float, where the exchange rate is determined by market forces, to a pegged system that has some aspects of the pre-73 Bretton Woods system of fixed exchange rates. Some 21% of the IMF members allow their currency to float freely. Another 23% intervene in only a limited way, so-called managed float. A further 5% of IMF members now have no separate legal tender of their own. This figure excludes the European Union countries that have adopted the euro. These are typically smaller states, mostly in Africa or in the Caribbean, that have no domestic currency and have adopted a foreign currency as legal tender within their borders, typically the US dollar or the euro. The remaining countries use more inflexible systems, including a fixed peg arrangement, 43%, under which they peg their currencies to other currencies such as the dollar or the euro, or to a basket of currencies. Other countries have adopted a system under which their exchange rate is allowed to fluctuate against other currencies within a target zone, an adjustable or crawling peg system as it's called. In this section, we'll look more closely at the mechanics and implications of exchange rate regimes that rely on a currency peg or target zone. Under a pegged exchange rate regime, a country will peg the value of its currency to that of a major currency so that, for example, as the US dollar rises in value, its own currency rises too. Pegged exchange rates are popular among many of the world's smaller nations. As with full fixed exchange rate regimes, the great virtue claimed for a pegged exchange rate is that it imposes monetary discipline on a country and leads to low inflation. For example, if Belize pegs the value of the Belizean dollar to that of the US dollar so that $1 US equals $1.97 Belize, then the Belizean government must make sure the inflation rate in Belize is similar to that in the United States. An inflation rate in Belize that is greater than the US inflation rate will lead to pressure to devalue the Belizean dollar or to alter the peg. To maintain the peg, the Belizean government would be required to rein in inflation. Of course, for a pegged exchange rate to impose monetary discipline on a country, the country whose currency is chosen for the peg must also pursue sound monetary policy. Evidence shows that adopting a pegged exchange rate regime does moderate inflationary pressures in a country. An IMF study concluded that countries with pegged exchange rates had an average annual inflation rate of 8% compared with 14% for intermediate regimes and 16% for floating regimes. In 1997, a combination of adverse capital flows and currency speculation forced several Asian countries, including Thailand and Malaysia, to abandon pegs against the US dollar and let their currencies float freely. Malaysia and Thailand would not have been in that position had they dealt with a number of problems that began to arise in their economies during the 1990s, including excessive private sector debt and expanding current account trade deficits. There is some evidence that adopting a pegged exchange rate regime moderates inflationary pressures in a country. However, many countries operate with only a nominal peg and in practice are willing to devalue their currency rather than pursue a tight monetary policy. In some instances, it can be very difficult for a small country to maintain a peg against another currency if capital is flowing out of the country and foreign exchange traders are speculating against the currency. There are benefits nonetheless to smaller countries using a pegged rate. A dirty float system is a system in which a country's currency is nominally allowed to float freely against other currencies, but the government will intervene, buying and selling currency, if it believes that the currency has deviated too far from its fair value. Other countries, while not adopting a formal pegged rate, try to hold the value of their currency within some range against an important reference currency, such as the US dollar. Countries that commit to currency boards end up converting their domestic currency on demand into another currency at a fixed exchange rate. Hong Kong's experience during the 1997 Asian currency crisis, however, has added a new dimension to the debate over how to manage a pegged exchange rate. During late 1997, when other Asian currencies were collapsing, Hong Kong maintained the value of its currency against the US dollar at around $1.50 US to $7.8 Hong Kong, despite several concerted speculative attacks. Hong Kong's currency board has been credited with this success. A country that introduces a currency board commits itself to converting its domestic currency on demand into another currency at a fixed exchange rate. To make this commitment credible, the currency board holds reserves of foreign currency equal at the fixed exchange rate to at least 100% of the domestic currency issued. Exchange rate regimes vary. Governments around the world pursue a number of different exchange rate policies. 21% of the IMF's members allow their currency to float freely. Another 23% intervene only in a limited way, the so-called managed float. And 43% use more inflexible systems, including a fixed peg arrangement. The central bank of a country will intervene in the foreign exchange market to try to maintain the value of its currency if it depreciates too rapidly against an important reference currency. A central bank is the generic name given to a country's primary monetary authority, such as the Federal Reserve System in the United States or the Bank of Canada in Canada. Central banks usually have the responsibility for issuing currency, administering monetary policy, holding member banks' deposits, and facilitating the nation's banking industry. With the introduction of the floating rate system and the emergence of global capital markets, much of the original reason for the IMF's existence has disappeared. Many observers initially believed that the collapse of the Bretton Woods system in 1973 would diminish the role of the IMF within the international monetary system. The IMF's original function was to provide a pool of money from which members could borrow, in the short term, to adjust their balance of payments position and maintain their exchange rates. Financial difficulties have not disappeared. Some believed the demand for short-term loans would be considerably diminished under a floating exchange rate regime. And like any good bureaucracy, the IMF has found a way to grow and redefine its mission. The IMF lends foreign currencies to members to tide them over during short periods of balance of payment deficits. No major industrial country has borrowed funds from the IMF since the mid-1970s, when Great Britain and Italy did. Since the early 1970s, the rapid development of global capital markets has allowed developed countries such as Great Britain and the United States to finance their deficits by borrowing private money, as opposed to drawing on IMF funds. In order to receive such money, countries must abide by certain regulations and economic restraint, for example, England and New Zealand. Despite these developments, the activities of the IMF have expanded over the past 30 years. In 1997, the institution implemented its largest rescue packages until that date, committing more than $110 billion in short-term loans to three troubled Asian countries, South Korea, Indonesia, and Thailand. This was followed by additional IMF rescue packages in Turkey, Russia, Argentina, and Brazil. IMF loans increased again in late 2008 as the global financial crisis took hold. Between 2008 and 2010, the IMF made more than $100 billion in loans to troubled economies such as Latvia, Greece, and Ireland. In April of 2009, in response to the growing financial crisis, major IMF members agreed to triple the institution's resources from $250 billion to $750 billion, thereby giving the IMF the financial leverage to act aggressively in times of global financial crisis. A banking crisis refers to a situation in which a loss of confidence in the banking system leads to a run on the banks as individuals and companies withdraw their deposits. A foreign debt crisis is a situation in which a country cannot service its own foreign debt obligations, whether private sector or government debt. The primary crises since the 1980s have been the Third World Debt Crisis of the 1980s, the 1995 Mexican currency crisis, the crisis experienced by Russia as that country moved towards a market-based economic system, and the Asian financial crisis. The IMF's activities have expanded because of periodic financial crises that have continued to hit many economies in the post-Bretton Woods era. The IMF has repeatedly lent money to nations experiencing financial crises, requesting in return that the government enact certain macroeconomic policies. Critics of the IMF claim these policies have not always been as beneficial as the IMF might have hoped, and in some cases may have made things worse. The final criticism of the IMF is that it has become too powerful for an institution that lacks any real mechanism for accountability. The IMF has determined macroeconomic policies in those countries, yet, according to critics such as noted economist Jeffrey Sachs, the IMF, with a staff of less than 1,000, lacks the expertise required to do a good job. Evidence of this, according to Sachs, can be found in the fact that the IMF was singing the praises of the Thai and South Korean governments only months before both countries lurched into crisis. Then, the IMF put together a draconian program for South Korea without having deep knowledge of the country. Sachs' solution to this problem is to reform the IMF so it makes greater use of outside experts and so its operations are open to greater outside scrutiny. As with many debates about international economics, it's not clear which side is correct about the appropriateness of IMF policies. There are cases where one can argue that IMF policies have been counterproductive or only had limited success. For example, one might question the success of the IMF's involvement in Turkey, given that the country has had to implement some 18 IMF programs since 1958. But the IMF can also point to some notable accomplishments, including its successes in containing the Asian crisis, which could have rocked the global financial monetary system to its core, and its actions in the 2008 through 2010 crisis to contain everything, quickly stepping in to rescue Iceland, Ireland, Greece, and Latvia. Similarly, many observers give the IMF credit for its deft handling of politically difficult situations, such as the Mexican peso crisis, and for successfully promoting a free market philosophy. Several years after the IMF's intervention, the economies of Asia and Mexico recovered. Certainly, they all averted the kind of catastrophic implosion that might have occurred had the IMF not stepped in. And although some countries still faced considerable problems, it's not clear that the IMF should take much blame for this. The IMF cannot force countries to adopt the policies required to correct economic mismanagement. While a government may commit to taking corrective action in return for an IMF loan, internal political problems may make it difficult for a government to act on that commitment. In such cases, the IMF is caught between a rock and a hard place, because if it decided to withhold the money, it might trigger financial collapse and the kind of contagion that it seeks to avoid. The gold standard is a monetary standard that pegs currencies to gold and guarantees convertibility to gold. It was thought that the gold standard contained an automatic mechanism that contributed to the simultaneous achievement of a balance of payments equilibrium by all countries. The gold standard broke down during the 1930s as countries engaged in competitive devaluations. The fixed exchange rate system collapsed in 1973, primarily due to speculative pressure on the dollar following a rise in U.S. inflation and a growing U.S. balance of trade deficit. Since 1973, the world has operated with a floating exchange rate regime, and exchange rates have become more volatile and far less predictable. Volatile exchange rate movements have helped reopen the debate over the merits of fixed and floating systems. The Bretton Woods system of fixed exchange rates was established in 1944. The US dollar was the central currency of this system. The value of every other currency was pegged to its value. Significant exchange rate devaluations were allowed only with the permission of the IMF. The US dollar was the central currency of this system. The role of the IMF was to maintain order in the international monetary system and to A, avoid a repetition of the competitive devaluations of the 1930s, and B, to control price inflation by imposing monetary discipline on countries. The case for a floating exchange rate regime claims such a system gives countries autonomy regarding their monetary policy, and floating exchange rates facilitate smooth adjustment of trade imbalances. The case for a fixed exchange rate regime claims the need to maintain a fixed exchange rate imposes discipline on a country. Volatile exchange rate movements have helped reopen the debate over the merits of fixed and floating systems. We can also see that the floating exchange rate regimes are vulnerable to speculative pressure. The uncertainty that accompanies floating exchange rate dampens the growth of international trade and investment, and far from correcting trade imbalances, depreciating a currency on the foreign exchange market tends to cause price inflation. In today's international monetary system, some countries have adopted floating exchange rates. Some have pegged their currency to another currency, such as the US dollar. Some have pegged their currency to a basket of other currencies, allowing their currency to fluctuate within a zone around that basket. In the post-Bretton Woods era, the IMF has continued to play an important role in helping countries navigate their way through financial crises by lending significant capital to embattled governments and by requiring them to adopt certain macroeconomic policies. Oftentimes, this is seen as unfair because macroeconomic policies to resolve a country's debt crisis can add to political instability for an embattled government seeking to resolve its finances. An important debate is occurring over the appropriateness of IMF-mandated macroeconomic policies. Critics charge that the IMF often imposes inappropriate conditions on developing nations that are the recipients of its loans. The current managed float system of exchange rate determination has increased the importance of currency management in international businesses. The volatility of exchange rates under the current managed float system creates both opportunities and threats. It's believed that floating exchange rates facilitate smooth adjustment of trade imbalances. One way of responding to this volatility is for companies to build strategic flexibility and limit their economic exposure by dispersing production to different locations around the globe by contracting out manufacturing. We hope you have enjoyed this presentation. Accredited CE programs are objective and substance-based. They enhance professionalism and help advisors remain compliant in an ever-changing industry. In order to attain your continuing education credits, you must complete the following multiple choice exam. To complete this exam, please visit us here.